Alright, it looks like I'm back. Peter Galante here, and I'm here to talk today about recording video. One of the first things you really have to identify is the difference between shutter speed and frame rate. Students tend to confuse that a lot. So you can have your frame rate, and a long time ago at the beginning of the filmmaking industry, they discovered that 24 frames per second, 24 individual pictures per second, really gave natural movement. There's a phenomenon in the human eye where there's an image that persists on the retina, and that blends together. So at 24, if they projected 24 frames per second, it would give you the illusion of movement. Now, at fewer frames per second, you start to see the individual pictures, and at higher frames per second, you don't really benefit from that illusion of movement. So 24 frames per second became the industry standard. When television came along and they had to broadcast the video over the FM broadcast of TV, they discovered there was interference between the audio signal and the video signal, and they figured out if they adjusted the frame rate to 23.976 frames per second, they could solve that problem. So today we tend to call things 24 frames per second, when in reality in video it's 23.976. Some cameras that you might have actually shoot truly 24 frames per second. A real film camera would shoot at 24 frames per second. So you need to know exactly what the frame rate of your camera is shooting, and you need to look in your manual to figure that out. Now, you'll notice on many cameras there'll be 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, and 30 frames per second. Well, the 25 frames per second has to do with Europe. Europe has a different television standard. It has a different hertz frequency on their electric current. In the United States, it's 110 volts, 60 hertz. In Europe, it's 220 volts, 50 hertz. So they figured out that the 25 frames per second works better with the European television standard. So for our purposes, you just forget that your camera may shoot 25 frames per second. 30 frames per second will give you, I don't know, hard to explain, a little bit more of the ability to stop motion, but not much more. And we're not really going to go into that in Photo 130. So your camera may shoot at 1080p, which is P means progressive. Each individual image is an individual photograph, like film. Or you might shoot 720, which is a smaller frame size. And if you can shoot at 1080, I recommend that. But if you have to shoot at 720, which is a smaller frame size, as I mentioned, it's 1280 by 720. You can do that. Again, you have to pay attention to the frame rate. So if you're setting it at 1080p, 24 frames per second, this first assignment, you're going to need to know that you have to do your shutter speed at maybe 30th of a second, and then a higher frame rate. So I'm only doing this so that I can kind of show you on my camera the movie settings. Now I know it's a little bit hard to see. I'm going to try to put it up here, and I don't know if you can actually see the movie settings, and I'm going to click OK, and then I have frame size, frame rate, and you can see that I have here, I don't know if it's actually readable or it's going to be overexposed. I have a number of different settings. So I have 24 frames per second, 1920, 1080, and if I wanted to go to a higher frame rate, like 60 frames per second, I would have to shoot it at a lower frame size, 1280 by 720. Okay. Now, there's only one reason you might want to shoot it at 60 frames per second for our class, is that if you were trying to get a slow motion effect. So if we shot at 60 frames per second and we dropped it into a 24 frame per second sequence, we would get a longer, we would get like a slow motion. We would have more frames spread out over a longer time. So it gives you like a slow motion effect. But we're really not going to get into that here in Photo 130. Okay, so very difficult for me to demonstrate the camera differences because I can't really show you what I see. It's very difficult on this video to record that, and so you need to look at your camera settings, look at your manuals, and it'll tell you what kind of frames you want. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. If you have questions, you can always email me, but it's best if you look at your manual first, because I don't know about every camera and every capability. This is going to be a big transition from still to video, and I'm hoping you guys can wrestle with it and get it together. I'll do my best to help. Thank you. Ciao.